Okay, so here we are like 14 or 15 years after this camera was released. But today I'm gonna show you exactly how I shoot video footage using a Canon T3i, a Canon Rebel T3i. Makes it sound way cooler. I made a video a couple months ago titled, "Does Your Camera Matter?" where I put that very notion to the test. I hopped on Craigslist, I found this camera for 200 bucks, I bought it, and I spent a couple weeks putting it through its paces. I'll link that video here if you want to go check it out. In this video, I'm simply going to show you my video settings and everything I use to get the footage from my video out of this Canon T3i. All right, to set this thing up, the first thing I did is I twist the program knob up top to the video setting, which is just a little camera icon there. And then I flip it open and enter into the menu. And the first thing I set up, which is on the second menu page, is I went to the movie record size, the resolution and frame rate, and I chose 1920 by 1080p at 24 frames per second. That's what I shot all of my video on. The second thing I did was hop on over to the third menu page where it says picture style, and the picture style I chose was faithful. I looked at all of these briefly before I started shooting, and I just went with the profile that had the most neutral tones to it because I knew I was going to be doing a little color grading with the footage after the fact. So I wanted the most flat profile possible, and that was faithful. Another thing I always took into account for when shooting on this camera was shooting with a fixed custom white balance. You don't want to shoot really ever with a auto white balance because if your lighting changes in the middle of a clip, your white balance will start shifting and all your colors will start shifting as well with that, and it gets funky. In order to avoid that, you just shoot with a custom set white balance. So if I was shooting in daylight, I would hit the Q button here and go over to where it says white balance, and I would select daylight. And if I was in a situation like this with tungsten lighting, I would simply choose the tungsten light setting. That's really that simple. I also made sure my shutter speed was set up correctly for this camera, and I always want to make sure that my shutter speed is double my frame rate. And that goes for all cameras that I use, unless I'm doing something with like a slow shutter or purposely picking a fast shutter. Most of the time, my shutter speed lives at double the frame rate of the video I'm shooting. So for instance, I set up my camera earlier on at 24 frames per second. That means I want my shutter speed to be around a 48th of a second. Now on this camera, you can't have a 48th of a second, but you can have a 50th, close enough. So you just set it to 1/50th and you leave it there. Now to change the shutter speed, you use this dial up here. If your camera is set up like mine, you set it up at 50 and you leave it there. And the last thing I did with this camera before I started shooting for my video was I wanted to test the ISO because I knew that this thing, given it came out in 2011, wouldn't have very good low light performance. And I quickly found out I was totally right. I shot a couple tests and I found that anything at around 800 ISO and above started to fall apart really, really quickly. And that's not surprising. And that's not the end of the world. It just means I had to be a little bit more choosy on where I decided to film. So I made sure I filmed in situations that were much brighter and that I could have my ISO at around 400, 200, or 100. I really found that was the sweet spot of this camera that wouldn't introduce a bunch of noise to the image. I also realized while editing this video that there are two more settings that I should probably fill you in on. And the first is, in order to customize your exposure, you need to be in manual exposure. And to do that, you just go to the menu and it's on the first page and you just select manual for movie exposure. Once you're in manual exposure, you'll be able to adjust all of your settings to expose your image. And one of those things you'll be able to do is obviously change your aperture. Now, to change your aperture on this camera, you need to hold the AV button on the back of the camera while rotating this control dial. I'd also really like to address two things I was accused a lot of in the comment section of my video. And the first was that I used Magic Lantern to hack this camera to shoot better footage. Maybe hack isn't a great term to use, but essentially when you use Magic Lantern, if you're familiar with it, you upload their firmware to a memory card, you plug it into your camera, and it gives you the ability to do other things with your camera, like shoot raw video, I think, and a couple other things. I'll show you some screen grabs here of the data from the footage I recorded on this camera. As you can see, it is the H.264 codec that comes directly out of this camera, and it's at 1920 by 1080p. And that's what you get out of this thing when you set it up, as I've already told you. So to all of you out there that think I used Magic Lantern, I am sorry to disappoint you. I did not use Magic Lantern. If you want to use Magic Lantern, all the power to you, but I did not, so sorry. The other thing I was accused of with this camera was using really high-end glass on the camera and not the lenses I showed in the video. The only lenses I used to shoot my video was the 18-55 kit lens. It's stabilized, it has an aperture of 3.5 to 5.6 when you're out at 55 millimeters. I believe this is the lens you get when you buy the camera. And I used this one, and I also used the 50 millimeter 1.8, which was really handy to have because anytime I found myself in a lower light situation, like the interview portion of my video, I was able to use this lens and open up a bunch and get a bunch of light in, so I didn't have to boost my ISO like I mentioned earlier, which would have given me a very, very noisy image. So sorry to disappoint you all. I didn't put cinema glass on my Canon Rebel T3i. That would have been incredible, and I would have most definitely taken pictures of that. It's just these two lenses right here. So those are all the in-camera settings I used to set up my Canon T3i. I did do a couple things in the edit using DaVinci Resolve to further improve my footage. First thing I did was I knew I wanted to post this video on YouTube in 4K resolution. Obviously, this camera came out in 2011. 4K wasn't really as much of a thing back then. It doesn't shoot in 4K. So what I did was I selected all the clips in my timeline that were shot on this camera in 1080p, and I selected the feature that upscales the footage. I have no idea how that works, but it worked for this footage. I was able to export it in 4K. It didn't ruin the footage, it didn't fall apart, it still looks fine. The last thing I did to the footage I got from this camera was I applied a LUT to it, and I did a little bit of color grading. Now I have another video on my channel that goes in depth on my color grading process, and I specifically have a clip in that video from this camera, and I show you exactly how I deal with it. I recommend you go check that out if you want some more information on that. But I will say, if you do go buy LUTs for your Canon Rebel T3i footage, make sure you buy LUTs that are intended for a Rec 709 color space. I won't go into detail here about that, but that'll enable the LUT you buy to work seamlessly with the footage you get from this camera. I personally use LUTs from a company called Colorist Factory. They're a great company. I'm not sponsored. I bought the LUTs. They make great LUTs that really do wonders to your footage, and I really highly recommend them. That's everything I did to get footage out of this camera. It all can be done in camera. You don't need Magic Lantern. You don't need fancy lenses, maybe a couple LUTs if you want them. You can find LUTs for free online. A lot of software comes with LUTs. The barrier to get your footage to look like mine, if that's your goal, is pretty low if you already have the camera. Canon did a really nice job when they made this camera. Like, how many other things do you have that are 15 years old that you still pull off the shelf and use? I know that I don't have that many. The fact that they made a camera that has stood the test of time is pretty cool. And I love that there's still a big community of you out there that love this camera and use this camera. And I hope in another 10 to 15 years, we're still pulling this thing off the shelf and filming and having fun with it. Also, it's called Rebel. Like, camera companies don't have cool names anymore. They're all like numbers and letters. This camera was called a Rebel. That's cool. We need more of that, camera companies. Cooler names, not just numbers and letters. We want cool names like Rebel. Anyway, thank you all for watching, and I'll catch you later.